Good morning or good evening, wherever you are calling from. We are live again, and I just discovered that at this exact moment, Apple is having their live event. I'm not too disappointed if not too many people show up because I'm competing against Apple's announcement of presumably their iPhone 13. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this latest episode. This is episode 8, and there's only 2 more episodes before season 1 is finished. The podcast is called the China Myth Podcast, but I think season 1, eventually all of the content for season 1 is going to be kind of edited, and we're going to put a little bit more stuff in there, and it's going to be a book that I'm going to publish. And I'm still thinking about what the title of the book is going to be. It's probably going to be called The Chinese Honeymoon Period, as a description of how we are unintentionally misled into believing things that aren't true when we're doing business in China. And what happens is our egos, our myopia, all of that will compound the inability for us to really adapt to what works in China. We think of it as a game. It's playing the China game inside the Chinese arena. And most of you, even those who have been living and working in China for decades, may still not all know all of the rules and how to convince people to do certain things that otherwise would just be an endless circular conversation. Okay, so the title of episode 8 is When the Rubber Meets the Road. So that's an expression that I think all of us Americans know. When the rubber meets the road is things may be going good, but what happens when there is disagreement? What happens when there's conflict? What happens when things don't go as anticipated? Are we still able to have the same synergy? Are we able to still have the same level of trust and cooperation or whatever? And so this story is centered around my experience working for a Japanese company called Mitsumi as the global account manager for Motorola. So this was before Motorola was acquired by Google and then sold to, I think it was sold to a Chinese company. The company that also bought Lenovo. I think it was sold to Lenovo. They still use the Motorola brand, but Motorola is now no longer iconic American company. So this was 10 years ago. I think they were probably only on or like iPhone 3 at that period or iPhone 4. And so Motorola was still one of the top mobile device manufacturers or cell phone manufacturers. They had come off a very successful campaign with their Razr, and now with Android, to compete with Apple, they launched a series of Droid phones. So over the period of my experience, I had done 2 things. I had helped us become a preferred supplier for Motorola, and I had developed good Guanxi relationships at our factory in Tianjin, China, which was producing most of the Motorola products. So we weren't making Motorola phones, but we were making chargers, we were making Bluetooth headsets, we were making a kind of accessories for the ecosystem that supports a phone. Every phone has a charger. So we made a lot of the chargers, the portable chargers, the car chargers, a lot of that stuff. So we were making some special chargers for Droid phones at that time. Or we might have also been making Bluetooth headsets that would accompany some kind of promotional package that they were doing. So over the course of a couple years, becoming a Motorola preferred supplier and traveling every quarter essentially to the factory in China, I had developed a pretty good relationship with the local Chinese people there. Now, it was a Japanese company, so the high-level managers were Japanese, but there were also Chinese managers that handled different aspects. So Lu Wei is the main character. So he was the highest level local Chinese manager at the factory in Tianjin. And I had developed not only a great Guanxi relationship with Lu Wei, but also with all of the other people there. And we would go out to dinner, and I told the story about, when again, just look at the fact that it's almost like a fraternity. When guys at the factory are interviewing for an assistant. So the assistant will obviously be female. And it was this experience that I had where Lu Wei decided, since I happened to be at the factory, to involve me in their hiring process. So what was their hiring process? Their hiring process was basically a bunch of guys at one side of the conference room. And these young ladies would come in and interview. And none of the questions seemed to be at all related to work. It was basically, how well do you drink? Can you handle your alcohol? What are your hobbies? Really trying to find out if this person that you would bring on into the organization would be someone that could make the atmosphere for, to say it nicely, make the atmosphere better. And so I think in the podcast, I related it to I was interviewing people for Hooters. So every waitress at Hooters obviously has to be female, right? So the qualifications for the assistant at the Tianjin factory was very, very similar. But the fact that me as an American who travels from abroad to visit the factory would be involved in their local hiring practices is just an indication that I had become one of them, so to speak. My Guanxi had deepened where they were because I speak fluent Chinese and I have really good relationships with a lot of individuals in the design cycle at Motorola, that the collaboration between Mitsumi and Motorola felt more personal. I would send personal requests from the product manager, Robert, in Atlanta, or Ray in Chicago. I would say, okay, we really need to meet this price target in order to do whatever. And the fact, and when the people at the factory felt more connected to the customer, because usually there's a layer of Japanese management and then they just tell the factory what to do. There's no kind of connection with who the customer actually is, who's appreciating the quality of products that are being produced, and they just have no visibility in that. They only know their forecast. They only know what they're asked to do. So I was able to change that dynamic where Lu Wei and his team felt that they had a personal connection with Robert, because I would be back in Atlanta. I would meet with Robert and I may call Lu Wei and I would say, hey, I'm in the office with Robert. And he would really try to discuss this idea to see if the factory can do it. So those types of little things helped the factory become more interested in getting Motorola business, because they felt they were part of that whole design process. And they also felt appreciated when things went well and we were able to meet our demands and meet our requirements or whatever. Now, when the rubber meets the road is really talking about when I felt that my good rapport and good relationship with Lu Wei started to change. And it didn't start to change gradually. It changed almost like suddenly. And what happened is I got a call from Motorola. And they said, Gene, we need all hands on deck. because we're going to need your factory to work overtime to meet a certain forecast or a certain demand because they have a launch and they need all the accessories to be ready for the launch of the latest droid. So, I mean, it was one of those things, if you ever work in supply chain and you have a company like, Motorola may not have the leverage that an Apple would have with its suppliers, but at that period, they still had a lot of leverage. And it's just the way that this works. When any company, whether it's Samsung or Ericsson or Motorola or Apple, when they have urgent demand, their job of everybody in the supply chain is to push down the supply chain and squeeze as much as you can. So as soon as I got this call of how urgent this was, I was on the next flight from Atlanta to China. I mean, we're talking about a 12-hour time difference, and you're in transit essentially 24 hours from the time you leave your house to the time you arrive at the hotel or wherever destination you are. So essentially, I got a call from Ray, and I was at the factory 36 hours later. This is how urgent, quote unquote, this unexpected spike in demand was. So because of all of the goodwill that we had exchanged with all the successes that we had, the factory was very responsive initially. So I can remember we arrived. I think I might have gone directly to the factory from after I arrived in Tianjin. I didn't even go to the hotel. I just went directly to the factory, and it was early in the morning, and it was all hands on board. Everybody who could affect production was there. Lu Wei was the highest level Chinese person, and then of course the Japanese managers and myself, and we were in the conference room on a conference call with people at Motorola, and they were explaining to us what they needed and what the schedule was. And without getting into too many details, we had to go through every possibility to increase output and get it to the final destination, where we were even hand carrying finished goods daily. So we were even checking flight schedules to see how we can coordinate this batch getting on a hand carried flight to whatever destination it was, because it was a worldwide launch. So product had to go all over the world. And that's how urgent this thing was. And so for the first couple of days, nobody really slept. It was morning, monitoring production, talking with Motorola on what ideas they had, because they have a lot of manufacturing experience. So they would give us different ideas to try to squeeze a little bit faster, do a little bit more, run the, of course, obviously run production line continuously. And so I was kind of in the middle. I was translating all of the English obviously into Chinese, so the local people understood what was going on. And I just remember, because everybody's tired, I'm tired, I'm jet lagged, I'm tired, I haven't slept for 5 days essentially. And I can kind of remember, I just started pushing the responsibility. And this is the key concept in this episode, is 责任. Okay, who has the responsibility? So obviously in this case, it was Motorola's fault that they didn't forecast properly. But as I was communicating what was being said, I probably implied or gave the impression that, hey, you guys just do this because it's your responsibility. 是你的责任. And I obviously didn't say it in those words, and I'm kind of oversimplifying it, but I could just remember Lu Wei's attitude changing. And he kind of snapped back at me with something along the lines that, hey, come on, everybody's already working their asses off. What do you expect more that we could possibly do? Something like that. I don't remember the exact words, but it was just the feeling that's important. And basically, the feeling and the dynamic changed. And that's why I said when the rubber meets the road. When the rubber met the road, whose side was I on? Was I on Lu Wei's side and the factory side, and I was pushing back at Motorola, or was I on the Motorola side pushing down at the factory? And in this case, there was another dynamic, the Japanese managers. It was a Japanese company. Was I on the Japanese side? Because I was presumably a higher level manager along with the Japanese, and these were guys at the factory. So that entire dynamic really, I would say, triggered a tipping point where my relationship with Lu Wei and the factory was like never the same after that. And I'm hoping that by listening to this story, you can learn a lot of lessons that will help you maintain your guanxi and your good working relationship with the people in China that you are doing business with. So a lot of interesting things in this episode. I see two of you on the chat. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the comments, and we'll really try to get to those. But I also wanted to talk about 责任 a little bit more, or responsibility. So this is something that I talked about in a YouTube short. And I'm just going to go to kind of, China is traditionally a collectivist culture. So everything is shared, including responsibility. So personal responsibility is not something that people embrace, not something that people want. Now, people want accolades, people want opportunities, but people don't want responsibility that could lead to blame. So it's very nuanced. And if you don't understand the nuances, you'll think, well, that's strange. Every Chinese person seems to want the responsibility. So it depends on how you define responsibility. And I think the way that I try to capture how it's different is in China, responsibility or 责任 or 责任感 is the feeling, is something that is felt, but is never verbalized, or it's never spoken, which means that you don't tell somebody to take responsibility, or you don't try to convince somebody to take responsibility. You just appreciate responsibility that people take. So I said that it's not something that is actually presumed or credited. It's something that is presumed and credited, but it's not a condition that is promised or assigned. So let me say that again. I reversed it. It's something that responsibility in China is something that is presumed or credited, but not something that's promised or assigned. So as a foreigner doing business in China, you really should just praise those who assume responsibility, give a lot of face for responsible behaviors, and that's it. Because demanding personal responsibility is almost a complete waste of time, because you'll get lip service and you'll get acknowledgement, but you won't actually get the behavior that leads to responsibility, leading to a better outcome. All right, so we got one question here in the chat. It says, you mentioned Chinese drinking culture. When production quotas created tension, why didn't you just bring the guys to the pub and tell you without others around that the whole thing was BS? Yes. So in that situation, we were all working 24/7, so we couldn't bring people to the pub. But that's also an interesting question, because China is a very hierarchical kind of society, especially in a Japanese management system, especially at a factory or a Chinese state-owned enterprise. So at all the times that I drank with Lu Wei, which was a lot over 2 or 3 years, we actually never went to the pub. There were 2 places where we would drink. We would either drink at a restaurant or VIP room, which is the story that I told, in which we drank fake alcohol, and a lot of colleagues actually wound up in the hospital, and I had the worst hangover of my life, and nobody actually really thought to blame the convenience store that sold the fake alcohol. Everybody just thought it was bad luck, because fake alcohol is everywhere. It's just kind of unbelievable if you are a foreigner. You say, how could something like this happen, and that people don't really care? But there's the second place where I went to drink with Lu Wei, and that is at a KTV. And KTV, as you know, or may not know, a KTV is a private VIP room where you have private hostesses or girls for every customer. So let's say me, Lu Wei, and two other people go into a KTV. So we're in a private VIP room, or bāofáng. There's a big projection monitor in front. It's either a TV or a projection video, and you order songs that you can sing. But before that, every customer gets to pick a girl, a hostess, to sit next to them. So that lady or that girl is basically going to cater to you for that entire evening. Pour your drinks, sing with you, chat with you, dance with you inside the KTV. That's the form of relationship building that is very Asian. It actually probably started in Japan, because KTV comes from karaoke, which is originated in Japan. That drinking and entertainment culture was brought to the rest of Asia, including China. And then China, like everything, just amplified it and took it to the next level. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I think also, to answer your question, I think initially, I did tell Lu Wei that this is BS. It's all Motorola's fault. You guys are going to get credited for whatever you do, and you didn't really do anything wrong. It's just what happens over time. Saying a few nice words in the beginning to make people feel good, if it's not sustained, and this was, again, I think over an entire week we were there expediting production, it's hard to sustain. And that's why it's when the rubber meets the road. If you can say something, you say something that is beneficial, but as people are actually going through the motions of doing things over time, how well can you sustain that? And it's really just, it really is that you cannot really fake who you are and what you believe, which is why I never try to give advice on things that you should do or you shouldn't do, even though I do that. But I have to put it into the context of, how do you make an adjustment to your attitude, your mindset, and then your approach? Because if your attitude is not aligned with the words that you say, you will not get the results that you want. All right. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for the question, because drinking culture is very important. The story in episode 8 involves our drinking culture and how different it is than what we would do here in the West or in America. But ultimately, all of these Chinese customs and traditions has one purpose, and that is to deepen guanxi. And as guanxi deepens, it enables you to get more accomplished, because people are willing to work harder and to do more when guanxi is at stake. Because if they don't, it affects their face or their mianzi. So it's all connected with Chinese culture, Chinese habits, Chinese customs, Chinese traditions, as we talked about in the tea drinking when I was working at a Chinese SOE. It's all connected, but your job is not to adopt these behaviors necessarily. It's to take these stories and the lessons and try to open your imagination and have more curiosity about why Chinese people think the way they do and behave the way they do without judgment, and then figure out what attitude I should change or what mindset I should adjust based on hopefully getting a wider perspective of what's going on. And that's the way you actually overcome the things you don't know when you go to a foreign culture, your unknown unknowns. You use a lot of imagination, that's positive. You use purpose-driven curiosity to really try to understand what makes someone else tick. And then you try to make the adjustments in your attitude and mindset based on trying to be one of them, trying to belong, trying to fit in. You don't have to change your values, but to understand their values will help you go a lot further. And I'll just leave it at that. All right. So this is the end of our YouTube live. This was, again, only 2 more episodes in season 1. So I hope you're subscribed. Go back, start with episode 1, because there's a progression on the concepts and the lessons, and it's going to make a lot more logical sense, because sometimes I'll talk about the characters and the people and the things that we did early on in the earlier episodes as we go through. Episode 9 will release tomorrow, and I am currently working on episode 10. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care. And again, if you have any questions, always post them in the comments, and I will monitor them and continue to answer them as we move forward. All right. Thanks, everybody.